In this video, I'm going to be discussing this handout on writing. Well, and the next video. So make sure you have this handout. I'm going to start at the end of the handout, but I'm going to talk through the handout here and sort of fill out the bones, put some meat on the bones of this handout in the next two videos. So on the final page, I've given you some bibliographic style guides, and it's not really a big deal to me which of these you choose. And you know, this doesn't have everything on it, but it has a lot of the things you might want to cite, like books, journal articles, etc. I find that in philosophy writing, Chicago style is most common. In other academic disciplines, APA or MLA is also extremely common. Again, like I said, I don't really have a strong preference. And I'm including this here just to give you an idea of what your bibliography should look like. So when constructing your bibliography for my papers, please, use one of these styles. I'm not, it's not a huge deal. But I do like to see a well done bibliography. All right. On the second to last page, I give you this strategy that'll help with writing. And the idea is, in this strategy, I compare writing a paper to building a house or a building or something like that. And the idea is, for every part in the paper, for every word in your paper, you should be able to justify that word, right? So after you finish writing a sentence, read back over it, check and make sure that you've expressed the idea that you were after in the clearest, most concise way possible. Make sure that you understand what each word is doing, why you've put it there, and where and whether the word leaves the point vaguer than it should. So, I mean, in a lot of the papers that I've seen, and this is very common in philosophical writing, often people use the wrong word, or a word that leaves more vague the point that they're trying to express, and so they don't quite manage to express that point. And if you leave a point vague, then that often means you won't be able to build on that sentence in the way that you need to, right? Like if you say, faculties for knowledge, say, in writing about Aristotle and how we get our knowledge of, say, a piece of wax. But what you should have said was, Aristotle thinks we use our senses, imagination, intellect, or if in talking about senses, imagination, intellect, you don't get into the objects of sense, but you just say, there are objects out there in the world, right? That's all leaving vague what you should be talking about in a way that's gonna harm your paper down the road, because you won't be able to introduce at the level of detail that you need to the topics in question. And so the paper isn't gonna do the work that it needs to do effectively. It's gonna stay too abstract. It's not gonna sort of get down into the details, and so it's just not gonna be as good. So after you've reread a sentence, after you write it, and made sure that each word is doing exactly what you need it to be doing, second, make sure that each sentence ties into the next. And in particular, be really careful here about jumping from one idea to another, and not making clear what the connection between them is. So, I mean, in writing, say, an essay on the Euthyphro, in presenting the argument of the Euthyphro, you've got to make sure you had to make sure that each sentence tied into the next, tied into the next, tied into the next. And to do this, you're going to use phrases like so, next, then, therefore, thus, however, but, and, or, if, then, for example, take the case where, in order to, etc. Right? So those are all examples of phrases that will help you tie one sentence to the next. And in doing this, you should be natural, right? I mean, I'm a reasonable reader. When I read things, I can figure out what's going on if it's well put. And so be natural. If making an obvious connection explicit between two sentences is going to require some monstrous contortion of language or excessive repetition or something that is ugly but unhelpful, then don't worry about it, right? I mean, and here you're just going to have to learn to use your judgment. I mean, that's part of the talent or skill, I should say, of writing. So third, after you've connected your sentences together, once you've got a whole paragraph, make sure all of the sentences in the paragraph fit together into a convincing argument or explanation. And in particular, I strongly recommend that you reread the paragraph out loud to yourself. So after finish writing a sentence, I think you should be reading it back over. Read it back over out loud. I think that really helps to catch a lot of mistakes, a lot of things that your eyes would just pass over, but you can hear when you hear yourself say them out loud. So reading back over your paragraphs will involve making sure that your words convey the ideas that you want them to convey, and that the connections between the ideas are there, right? That you've connected the sentences together in the way that you want them connected, and that all of these ideas and connections come together to form a whole that's to some degree self-standing, right? So a paragraph is a self-standing argumentative unit, and so what you should want out of each paragraph is a self-standing, to some degree, argument, right? You want to be establishing your topic sentence, and then that topic sentence is going to fit into an overall argument of the paper, right? And so for longer papers, once you have a draft of the whole paper, just as you are reading back over to check each paragraph, after you finished a paragraph, read back over the draft and make sure that each paragraph fits appropriately into the overall structure of the paper, and that the overarching thing that you're trying to do in the paper is done, right? I mean, you're always going to have a thesis that you're trying to establish. And so read back through the draft and make sure that you've established convincingly the thesis you'd have set out to establish. So each paragraph should contain a sub-argument or explanation that does exactly the work that's needed in that particular point in the overall paper. And taken together, the paragraph should effectively establish the overall conclusion of the paper. You might think of the individual paragraphs here as like organs, each of which contributes to the overall function of the organism in their own appropriate way, right? I mean, so each paragraph is a part in a whole. It's like a heart or the lungs, and the heart or the lungs or the kidneys, right? They all have to function correctly if you're going to survive, if you're going to be a living being and keep on living. And similarly, in your paper, all of the paragraphs have to do what they need to do in order for the paper to make its argument successfully. And so if one of your organs is failing in making your argument, well, then your paper is just going to fall apart. It's not going to be successful, right? So there's a lot of steps that go into writing a successful philosophy paper, and every single one of those steps has to be well executed. And if any one of them falls down, well, then the argument of the paper is going to collapse. And so this strategy involves a lot of reading and rereading. And this works better if you reread it out loud, as I was saying. You'll be able to catch a lot of mistakes that your eyes would have otherwise passed over. And I mean, just, as a bit of evidence, in my own writing, you know, I mean, so professors, only half of what they do about is teaching, right? The other half is writing. I spend, you know, as much time writing as I do teaching. And in writing, I constantly and obsessively read back over my writing. So I'm every time I write a sentence, I read it back over. Every time I write a paragraph, I read it back over. Every time I have a draft of a paper, I read it back over. You know, by the time I send out a piece of work, I have probably read back through it 50 times easily. And I've often rewritten it from scratch, you know, 3 or 4 times. And that's just what philosophy takes. I mean, so I encourage you to draft papers early, read them over many times, let them sort of sit on them, right? And you should give yourself as much lead time as possible. I mean, I'll talk about this a little bit more when we turn to the rest of the handout. But drafting and editing your own work is fundamental. I mean, you cannot write a good philosophy paper without doing that. The difference between an A paper, and I'm going to say it again later, the difference between an A paper and a B paper is editing. And the difference between a B paper and a C paper is editing, usually. I mean, not always, but I would say in 80% of the cases, you know, it's a matter of whether the person wrote the paper the night before and had a chance to edit it, or wrote it the week before and actually had a chance to edit it, right? Like, that's the difference in a letter grade, easy. All right, I'm gonna stop the video here. Well, let me say one more thing before I stop the video. So I've also given you this checklist for your essay. And I'm not gonna read through the checklist here. A lot of these same points will be covered in the rules for writing a philosophy essay, which will be the next video. But in writing your papers, use this checklist, right? So, you know, at the bottom, I give you some guidelines for what grades papers will receive depending on how they look on this checklist. This checklist is a good guide for writing a philosophy paper. So if you can go through and you can honestly say that your paper fulfills all of the requirements on this list, it's probably an A paper. But you have to be honest in the assessment of your paper. But it should give you a good idea of what I'm looking for in a philosophy paper. All right, in the next video, I'm going to turn to the rules for writing a philosophy paper, the first 2 pages of the handout. See you there.